Hello again. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the terminology from Chapter 11, the South and Slavery during the first half of the 19th century. And you got to understand the climate in the South is very similar to the Marianas. It's very hot and humid much of the year, and that lent itself to commodity crop production. And because of that, the plantation system came to dominate Southern life. And with the invention of the cotton gin in the very early 19th century, which made some strains of cotton now viable as economically productive, the peculiar institution, as Southerners called slavery, came to dominate the labor source of this particular plantation system. And as time went by, it became race-based slavery, something unique to the United States that hasn't really existed in other parts of the world. Slaves had slaves in other parts of the world. Slaves could buy their freedom. This was not possible in the U.S., and that's what made it such an evil institution. And you also have the idea of white supremacy that came as this went by. Time went on. You could always justify yourself as being better than any black person. And also as time went by, the agrarian aristocracy believed itself to be distinct and better than those in the North, those money-grubbing, commerce-oriented, factory worker dependent upon systems that they felt was just not a nice way of living or a good way to try to make a living. Whoop, skipped ahead too much. Southerners believed that they were paternalistic and that they would have a better way of dealing with their workers when they got old. They just stayed on the plantation and they were cared for in their basic needs with housing, clothing, and food. And you had distinctive economies that grew up in the different parts of the South, such as the Upper South, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and West Virginia. Eventually, when the war broke out, will break away from Virginia. The mountainous part of Virginia will be loyal to the North. You have the border states. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware is sometimes considered a border state. Slavery is disappearing there because cotton really is not a viable commodity crop in that cold climate. 90% of blacks in Delaware were free. And then you have the lower states where King Cotton reigned supreme and the plantation system and the slaveocracy ruled. They had a huge investment in slavery and they were going to protect it. And they were always very, very afraid of slave rebellions. And again, with the invention of the cotton gin, the old Southwest becomes an area like Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, western Georgia will be very conducive to cotton production. And because of that, in the early 19th century, Andrew Jackson will be heavily involved in the removal of Native Americans, culminating in the Trail of Tears, where the Cherokee Nation was forced to move out of North Carolina into what is today the state of Oklahoma, which until the early 20th century was Indian territory. By 1860, more millionaires lived in Natchez, Mississippi than anywhere in the world. That's just an unbelievable fact. And with this expansion in cotton production, slavery expanded. Not as the founders wished. It was not on its way out. It became even larger because there is no cheaper labor than slavery. And in the early 19th century, cotton prices were on the rise. More and more money could be made. And the Industrial Revolution, which had taken place first in Great Britain in the textile manufacturing area, Britain's large supplies will come from the Deep South until they introduced more cotton production in India, but that comes in much later in the 19th century, especially after the Sepoy Rebellion in the 1850s. And with all commodities, this is a boom-bust economy. it is going to have cycles of great prosperity, and it's going to have cycles of the prices collapsing. That's the problem with all bubble economies. At all times, this planter elite, or the slaveocracy, or the plantation owners, is a very small part of the population. And they're going to control Southern politics, unfortunately, and they'll lead the South to ruin. You have to own more than 20 slaves to be classified as planter elite. They're always engaged in defending their honor, and they're keeping a keen eye on commodity prices at all times. And if they believe that their honor had been violated, they will resort to dueling with pistols. Mary Boykin Chestnut was a famous author of the Civil War, and she later won a Pulitzer Prize for some of her portrayals of the Old South. The plantation mistress supervised domestic household and was concerned with these areas of the household. They also saw the birthing of babies, both by whites and by the slave women. There was also plain white folk that lived in the Old South. Yeomen, small farmers who grew farms and traded for their necessities. And they are not at the same status as the planter elite. They are below them, but they will always be above the slave class. Slave codes were enacted in each state to try to prevent runaways or rebellions. You had mulattoes, who were a mixed race of white, black, what was viewed in those days as miscegenation or race mixing. You had a man by the name of Yarrow Mahmoud, who was an African Muslim who purchased his freedom, acquired property, and he settled in Washington, D.C. There were slaves that got out of the system, but it was not common. The domestic slave trade was fueled by Virginians trying to maintain their wealth because the tobacco production that had preceded cotton production exhausted the fertility of the soils, and they will be engaged with selling slaves to the Deep South, and nearly 1 million were sold in the first half of the 19th century. Most of these slaves were field hands. They worked from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. And they were punished brutally. Slavery is rooted in brute force. That is the only way to maintain control over this system. Urban slaves in the cities had greater mobility, engaging in chores for their masters. But unfortunately, female slaves faced a great amount of sexual abuse by the masters. They are encouraged to have as many children as possible, and the owners had many affairs with their slaves, as Thomas Jefferson did with Sally Hemings. Spirituals, African American religion, developed as a coping mechanism. And after the Civil War, they will have their own churches. Slave rebellions, there's the famous one, Gabriel Prosser in 1800 in Virginia, Charles de Salons in New Orleans, Denmark Vesey in South Carolina, and the last big one was Nat Turner's rebellion. He was a black overseer preacher. He believed he was going to lead the South into freedom. He murdered slaveholders and families, and federal troops actually got involved in killing hundreds of slaves in retaliation for this uprising. After this, the Underground Railroad would develop. Harriet Tubman was a famous conductor who went back into the South numerous times and led slaves to their freedom into the North and Canada. There would be safe havens in different cities or areas along the way to freedom. Everyday forms of resistance, sabotage, illness, or the breaking of tools. And this ends chapter 11 on the South and slavery.